Hello, welcome. This is Rich Larson from Watermark Learning, and I want to welcome you to our session on root cause shouldn't hurt like a root canal. We're going to go over 5 proven techniques to help you understand business needs. And as we get started, I want you to take a look at our services. We're sponsoring this webinar, and just a real quick message about Watermark Learning. We are a training company. You may or may not know about us. I think a lot of you probably got wind of us from the email announcement. But anyway, in case you're not familiar with us, we offer a variety of skills and certification training and course materials. Today's webinar is a detailed overview of root cause analysis, as you're going to find out in just a second. We also have a new mode of learning that we call training tapas. We're really pleased with that whole effort because it gives you a little bit deeper dive without having to devote 2 or 3 days to a longer class. I know everybody's schedule is really tight and you want more learning appetizers. That's why we call it training tapas. And so we have other topics besides this one, many on Agile, and a cool series we call our Thinking Smarter series. So do check them out after the session. What we're going to talk about today, this is kind of root cause. Is it a root canal? Has anybody had a root canal? I've not had one, luckily. Let's get rid of that one and talk about the fact that we often jump to conclusions and don't always get to the root cause and end up having the problem persist and very often trying to solve the wrong problem. And then only during the life of a project, let's say, or whatever, do we discover what the needs are after many false starts or expenses and so on. What I want to use is this example of the Jefferson Memorial. You might have recognized that from this picture, which is much prettier than a root canal, by the way. The Jefferson Memorial had a problem a few years back with the frequent need for repainting. I don't know if it was every 6 months or something. That's way too often. And what they discovered was that they had to repaint it because they had to power wash it frequently, like every week or I don't know how often. I forget some of the details of the story, but that's not relevant. What caused the frequent watching of the building was the fact that at dusk, when they turned on the lights on this beautiful monument, that they found bugs swarmed the monument. And guess what happens when bugs swarm around? Birds get attracted to them and gobble them up. Well, when birds gorge themselves, guess what they do? When that happens, a lot of doo-doo showed up on the memorial, and they had to power wash it way too often. Once they discovered that was the real root cause, they finally solved their painting problem. It was really a lighting problem, and they turned on the lights a little bit later, and that miraculously caused way fewer bugs to come out, and so that basically solved their problem. And so it's, to me, a classic example of getting to the root cause and getting a lasting solution. Now, imagine if you went to the dentist and said, I got a toothache. You know, think back about that picture of the root canal. And the dentist immediately jumped to the conclusion that you need a root canal to fix it. It probably would, but it's probably overkill, very painful, way more expensive than you need. And so we certainly don't want that. So in this webinar, I want to talk to you about the importance of business needs as a table setting for us to talk about the different techniques for understanding those needs and be able to provide effective solutions faster. The techniques are ones that have been around for a while. I always like to say, though, that a good technique stays good, and there's no reason why we can't use it and employ it in a variety of settings, whether it's in a traditional kind of waterfall type project or a hybrid setting or a pure agile setting. It doesn't matter. These are useful techniques. And so we'll then wrap up and talk about the categories of techniques where you would use them, a very short summary. All right, before we get started, I also usually like to find out the makeup of the audience, and so I've got a little poll that I'm going to launch. If you could just check in on it, please, and tell me, what is your primary job title? Let's see. I got to get the poll launched properly, and then we can rock and roll. Okay. It's still not showing, so let me click another button here to make it launch. There we go. what would you say your primary job responsibility is? And just take a moment to click one of the selections. Great, most of you have voted, so I'm going to close the poll now, share the results. About half the audience is a BA. Almost 20% are PMs, 20% are hybrids, a BA, PM, and then we have a smattering of other people. So great, thank you for sharing that, guys, with me, because it gives me a sense of where you're coming from. And let's talk about needs then, the importance of them, and setting the stage for what I want to talk to you about. Maslow, in his hierarchy of needs, talked about motivators and emotional needs, and that's not what I'm talking about here. You might recognize this kind of chart from having taken the PMP or the CVAP exam, because it's a common backdrop for the work we do, but that's not what I want to talk about, nor do I want to really talk about needs versus wants. I mean, we frequently, that dilemma of what do we want to focus on, and do we care what people want, or we just want what they need? Actually, if I say I need something, does that, like a new pair of shoes, does that mean I'm really shoeless? And by the way, these are not my feet, despite popular opinion. I'm a runner, and these are things I'd never consider wearing. These are running shoes, believe it or not. Anyway, the sense here is that if I say I need a new pair of shoes, what I'm really saying is I want a new pair of shoes and I'm willing to pay for them. And that's really what I'm talking about in terms of projects, because with any kind of a project, you need some sponsorship and people willing to pay for them, and we're not really caring about needs versus wants and so forth. But there's also a side to this I want to explore with you, and I want you to use the GoToWebinar question panel to send me in your thoughts, please, about what you think of needs. Why are they so important? What happens if you don't supply them or understand them at the start of a project? What are some of the downsides to not understanding needs? So please take a moment to send in just your quick thoughts. Let's see. Somebody says they're the goals. And if you don't understand them, why are you doing what you're doing in the first place? That can cause confusion and can be unmotivating, right? If you're really not understanding why we're headed down a certain path. So great, I'm seeing more come in. Somebody says you can't address a problem or situation properly. Needs are important to solve business problems. Absolutely. You will get missed functionality or missed requirements and low acceptance level from your stakeholders. Absolutely. If needs aren't met, then the product does not provide value, somebody else says, and adds nasty assumptions. The actual problem may not be addressed if the needs aren't well understood, somebody is saying. And different people want different things, absolutely. So you have some stakeholder analysis to take care of there, don't you? It's a baseline to measure success at the end of a project, somebody is saying. Another person says it drives the minimum necessary for the product. I like that. I like all of these, actually. Provide wrong requirements and potentially derail the project if you don't get them right. Thanks for that, Eve. And what people state as needs may not be what is really needed to solve the problem. Absolutely. I think I want to end there, because I think that's, to me, like another kind of a very salient point, because people often, we talk about jumping to solutions, and it's for a variety of reasons, whether we think we understand the problem, what we think we want is not always what is really causing the problem. And that's, to me, why the concept of using root cause analysis is so helpful to truly getting to business needs, and that's the basis of what I'm going to talk about today. I think we also know that needs are not the same as requirements. They're at different levels. We need different techniques to elicit them and to manage them. Requirements are obviously much more detailed. But things do start from needs, don't they? That's really the basis of everything we do. The requirements come from those needs, at least they should. Or else how do we jump into the requirements if we don't understand the business needs? And in the new BABOK version 3, requirements are usable representations of needs, and designs are usable representations of solutions. And then from there, the actual solution that we deliver to our customer, whether it's incremental or in one big shot, it doesn't matter. This slide to me captures the importance of needs that you probably intuitively understand, but I'd like to use a visual to help kind of get that point across. And for me, this is helpful to think about in this light. In BABOK version 3, the BA body of knowledge, and you may or may not be familiar with this and may not be familiar with the core concept model, but there are 6 of these core concepts in the BABOK. Needs is in the upper left-hand corner, which is kind of psychologically interesting to me. I'm a psychology major, so maybe I read too much into these things. But besides needs and stakeholders are referenced more often in the core concept model than any of the other items, changes, solutions, and so on. And so you could think of business analysis as focusing on stakeholders with needs, because those are the 2 that are mentioned the most. And by the way, the BABOK defines in a short definition of needs as a problem or opportunity to be addressed. And so many of you, when you made your comments a second ago, were talking about that very same thing. Now, looking in the BABOK a little bit further, I was curious. Needs are not really a numbered item in the BABOK. Some of the other things like tasks and techniques are called out specifically, but needs are kind of just sitting out there as kind of a thing that we need as an input. So the very first task in the BABOK uses needs as an input. So when we're planning our approach, we have to take needs into account. Well, how do we understand what those needs are? Really, the BABOK doesn't directly address it per se with a task, but I'll talk to you about that. There are many techniques, though, as we're talking about today, that do address it. Another important part of the BABOK is when you start preparing for elicitation, needs are, again, one of the primary inputs. And I think that's so important because after we elicit information in needs and requirements and so forth, most of our other work takes place after that. So it's sort of a very pivotal input to many of the things we do in our work. You may have heard about the BA standard from PMI that just was released late last year. The first domain in the standard is needs assessment. And one of the early tasks is assessing the current state from which needs then are output and their input then to dealing with everything else, including determining the future state and coming up with solutions. So the business need is quite prevalent or prominent there as well. And the PMI standard defines business needs as the impetus for a change in organizations, which is based on an existing problem or opportunity. So there's a lot of concordance between the 2 bodies of knowledge in terms of what a business need is. So having said that, let's take a look at the 5 different techniques that we want to use to help us understand needs better. And these are techniques that I've used on and off in my career to good effect, and they're not by no means the only ones, but there are 5 that I find practical for different reasons, which I'll share with you. They are also either in the BA body of knowledge from IIBA, the BA standard from PMI, or both. So they're very industry standard type things. So for instance, they're used for different purposes. So like interviewing is obviously one of the most common, if not the most common technique, but I'm going to talk about consultative interviewing to use to understand needs, especially with other techniques, such as the 5 whys. It's more of a mindset than a technique, although it's listed as techniques in the bodies of knowledge, but it helps us get to the root cause, as does a Fishbone or a mind map. And those are brainstorming tools to help us get to root cause. Pareto diagrams are useful when you have data that you can explore the most important factors about the root cause. And interrelationship diagrams are also very useful for getting to complex causes where maybe one effect is the cause of another, and that other is then in turn the cause of yet another issue, and so where you have complex interacting factors. So a variety of situations, so we have a potpourri of things. Let's get started. First of all, interviewing is something I don't need to talk to you about, but I want to kind of frame it in terms of how we could interview more as consultants, what I call consultative interviewing, to help us get at business needs. Because it's different, I think, than eliciting requirements. It's more of the art and science of questioning that, if you do it right, it's in a professional way that respects clients' time and needs and interests, as also perhaps more collaborative. Now, you may do interviewing in this regard, in which case I don't have much to say to you. If you're already doing these things, I think it's wonderful. I think a couple of things I could add to the conversation, though, might be some tips about good listening skills. We'll talk about that a little bit. But essentially, in order to be a consultative interviewer, I think we want to do it to either upfront show our credibility, but then also build even more credibility. So we need to be prepared with our interview. We also have to ask questions in ways that build trust. And I think also, if we do it the right way, we will also achieve more buy-in, especially if people, as we talked about earlier, don't understand what their needs are. They might think it's one thing and they may discover it's something else. That requires buy-in, doesn't it? For them to change their thinking. So ultimately what we want to do is use this as we're acting as consultants to provide advice, sound recommendations, especially if they're not what the client had in mind in the first place, and also alternatives for our business partners to consider. Because the primary recommendation may or may not be acceptable. So let's take a look at a couple of thoughts about asking questions in a consultative way. What consultative interviewing or questioning is all about is helping discover together what the client needs are, as opposed to us coming in and we know better, we know what you need kind of approach, or the client thinking they know what they need. Just go build it for me. Those are two negative sort of stereotypes that are still prevalent out in the world. What we want to do is getting in a more collaborative way. One of those things you can do is to avoid leading questions. Those are questions where we already have an answer built into the question as a solution. Questions need to be motivating for people to open up and share their needs. If we already have the solution built into the question, that is a demotivator. In fact, you'll get two common reactions if you ask a leading question with the answer already built in. The client either feels dumb because they hadn't thought about it before, or they feel you're dumb because they have thought about it. Let's talk about something else now. By the way, these are both points that I gathered from a very interesting book on business analysis. No, I mean sales. I'm joking there. From Zig Ziglar, a noted sales authority. Some years ago, when I took over the sales function at Watermark, I got this book because I didn't really know anything about sales per se or sales management. And I found this book to be very, very interesting, because what I found Zig talking about really was business analysis. Believe it or not, his approach to sales has to do with understanding client needs, analyzing those needs, proposing solutions to the needs, and then following up on them. But does that sound like the kind of work we do? It sure did to me. And so I found that the book very interesting. So if you're looking for some other new approach to change your thinking a little bit, check out Zig Ziglar's book. In talking about leading questions, I find that we all use them in various ways, shapes, and forms. Whenever I ask this question about which of these leading questions do you use most often, I get some interesting results. So what I want you to do is take a look at that and shoot me in just a little quick note about which of these you use the most often. Which are the ones that you are most often guilty of using? Because we all use this. We all use leading questions. Uh, so please send me in what. Okay, which ones you use most often? Have you ever thought about it? Somebody saying, yeah, that's one, probably the one I'm most guilty of. Have you ever thought about it? Let me show you something. Have you ever thought about, that's another guilty one. So, yep, isn't it better to do this? Wouldn't you like to? I know. See, these are all things that are basically presenting a solution, aren't they? And I think in a consultative way, they do not help us get to understand business needs, because we already think we understand what those needs are. And great, thank you for sharing, guys. That's that. So my homework for you is to think about which of these questions you use when you use them. So next time you find yourself saying, have you ever thought about it? I want you to step back for a second and rephrase it to ask someone about what their needs are. Or to, secondly, if you really want to present a solution, state it as such. I mean, I'm still doing that at my advanced age because I find myself asking leading questions. I'll back up and say, wait, forget that. What I'm recommending is, so I think it's a way to build more trust and buy-in with versus presenting leading questions. Okay, as you're consultatively interviewing, if that's a proper adjective, consultatively interviewing, think about the nonverbals that you are getting from your interviewees. So what's the ridiculously low percentage of the feelings about a subject are communicated through the words? You probably have seen these kind of numbers before, but 7% is the number I've seen in some research that communicates how someone feels about something. So if they're saying, yeah, I kind of like that, you know, you're only getting 7% of what somebody really feels like. 38% is tone of voice, and fully over half is visual, so that if you do not have the ability to meet face-to-face, you're losing a lot of valuable information about what your interviewee is really feeling. So a live conference call is certainly better than an email, but face-to-face, obviously, or a webcam is best of all. So to help illustrate this, I'd like to use this to illustrate this tone of voice exercise. It's called, I never said you stole the money. Each word I'm going to read through is a different tone of voice. And notice how the meaning of the phrase changes each time. Because if I said, I never said you stole the money, that implies somebody else did, right? It's sort of like, you know, she or he said that over there. I never said you stole the money, which is maybe the most emphatic way to say this statement and say, as a denial, I never said you stole the money. That implies I might have written about it. I never said you stole the money. Maybe your partner did. I never said you stole the money. The doesn't really work too well. I never said you stole the money. Implies maybe you stole something else, like stocks or bonds. So it's kind of a fun, but very, I think, mindful kind of thing about tone of voice means so much, and for you to pay attention to that as you're talking. Okay, so that wraps up our discussion about consultative interviewing. The 5 whys is the next one. A mindset, again, more than a technique, but it's been around a long time. It's tried and tested, and people really like it. It's in both bodies of knowledge, and it helps us remind ourselves to get deep enough into a situation to really understand it. You have to go 5 levels deep. So what we're saying is, really, you will need to ask why up to 5 times to get to the root cause. Not literally saying why, like a 3-year-old, but more professionally using some consultative interviewing questions, as we just talked about, so that we can get people motivated to go deeper and not be bored by the conversation, to really open up and think about it as well, to get to a definition of what the root cause really is. And so we'll use it with some of the other analysis tools that we'll talk about today, and then anything else too as well. It's not just these 5 techniques that we're going to talk about today where you could use this. There are a lot of benefits for 5 whys because it's simple, it's easy to use, you can pull it out at a moment's notice in everyday dialogue, whether it's a one-on-one conversation by the water cooler or in a conference room. And funny, we say may identify the root cause. Well, then you might ask, why would we want to use it if it only may? It doesn't always work. Well, things are more complicated, right? Generally speaking, it's a good start to pointing you in the right direction. Sometimes you might get lucky, but therein lies a pitfall that you might really need to, and probably should, use other techniques to help confirm your hunches here. Because it could certainly bring you down the wrong path. As somebody said earlier, that there are many different maybe stakeholders that have different needs. If you only talk to a narrow subset, you might be going down the wrong path of what you think is a root cause. So that's the second big pitfall to using this technique. But generally, there's a lot of positive reasons why. But we don't want to ask like a drill sergeant or an evil dentist, oh, go away, go, or a prosecuting attorney, why? Instead, we want to develop some softer, more consultative phrases like these. Okay, tell me more about this. Can you elaborate on? How do you feel about it? How do you think about it? Help me understand this. And my favorite one, possibly of all, is what business problem are we trying to solve? The latter is particularly helpful when people want to jump to solutions, whether it's from the business standpoint, or I've found it even maybe sometimes more helpful with technical people who want to take us down a technical path because of some real or imagined constraint. Now, all of these are consultative type of phrases that actually are things that I remember from my psychology days, taking counseling classes about how do you get people to open up and tell you more. So it's interesting. So as needs assessors or needs analyzers, whatever you want to call us, we're more like counselors, aren't we? I think, to get people to really open up and be motivated to talk to us. It's kind of a quick, fun little example. Let's take a look at a 5 whys problem of having to fix potholes on Main Street again and again and again. Up in the Northland where I'm from, Minnesota, we have potholes that are, big enough to fit a small car into, it seems like. So if people want to just patch them over every year instead of getting them fixed, well, let's take a look at why that might not be such a good idea. So the first why might be, well, why do those potholes develop again? Well, because they seem to develop every year and they don't go away. Now, imagine you're talking to someone with knowledge of street repair or street maintenance on this. So you say, help me understand that. Why do they always come back? Well, your interviewee might say, over time, the asphalt deteriorates and it develops holes. Then you might say, well, why does that happen? So they tell you the freezing and the thawing of the asphalt wears it out. Which, by the way, I didn't know that until I put this little exercise together. That's why potholes develop. So I learned something by doing 5 whys. Here's kind of a fun slide I dug up about potholes. Imagine somebody actually fishing. I think it was staged, mind you, but still it's kind of funny to look at. So your 4th why is, I thought asphalt lasted forever. No, asphalt's only durable for 10 to 15 years, and then the coating begins to wear out and it starts cracking easier because of the freezing and the thawing. Whoa, tell me more about that. And so now we're down to the 5th level. Well, the city hasn't resurfaced Main Street for over 20 years because the cost of replacing it is way more expensive in any one year than resurfacing it. So guess what? We just do it again and again and again. So we're really down to the root cause, which is a money problem. So perhaps an outcome of all of this might be that you would recommend that you get a budget exception and repave the street, thereby saving maintenance for 15 to 20 years and showing the money savings over that time. So just kind of a condensed little example. All right. So somebody's asking, hello, great information I'd like to refer to after the webinar. Will slides be available after the webinar? Absolutely, they will. We're going to send you a link to be able to get the slides and so that you can refer to them. Thanks for asking that question, Herminder. Wonderful. All right. So now That is the second technique. Third technique is fishbones and mind maps, which are close cousins to each other. They are both snapshots of what's happening today, and they're taking a problem that's visible and backing into the different root causes in a visual way. And it also makes use of the 5 whys to be able to go down deeper and deeper and deeper, so that to allow you to focus on those causes. And the symptom is off to the right. So the main action is happening with the diagram in the bones of the fish, if you will, to help us really get down to those areas that we can understand the problem better, and to understand where we may need to do some more analysis to dig further, whether it's through some data gathering or some other modeling, like process modeling or observation, whatever the problem calls for. I'm assuming you've seen or done fishbones or mind maps before. And so just as a quick overview, as a refresher, or for those of you not as familiar, you start with a problem off to the right, and you have anywhere from 3 or 4 to maybe up to 8 different causes on the left as the major bones off the fish, and then sub bones, if you will, that go deeper and deeper for each of the selected causes. What you have available are usually a series of cause categories that the originators of the fishbone used to be more commonly called the Ishikawa diagram in honor of the inventor of it. But you don't have to be limited by these categories. These are good starter selections, but you can have anything that's relevant to your situation at hand. So let's take an example where you might have, you might be a medical facility, healthcare provider, whatever, and you have to transfer medical records out of your company to another medical provider. And you're getting complaints and maybe even fines or whatever that your transfer process is too slow. So you might start off by coming up with a people category. And by the way, I commonly joke that if a problem is worth doing a fishbone, it probably requires a people category, because people are probably part of the cause. So in this case, there's a couple of things going on, but probably not the biggest contributor. But you might find if you go down a process path and look at, well, we have an inefficient transfer process. Why is that? We have manual and serial processes. Well, why do we have serial processes? Well, because we still use paper records, and we have to go from one department to another. We can't do it all at once, so it slows us down. So that kind of thing can lead you to some very interesting directions. So let's say maybe we also have machinery involved because we're faxing our records, but that doesn't really convince you that there's much here. So you keep going with this, and you have systems as another category that should be explored, because there's a lot here. We have limited automation in our systems because of limited budget and lack of security. We also have to comply with a healthcare regulation called HIPAA here in the US to possibly slow us down as well. So there are a variety of things here. And by the way, I don't mean to imply that these things are done 1, 2, 3, 4 in that order. It's really meant as a brainstorming tool, and best done as a group with a variety of stakeholders available to throw out different cause categories. You need to facilitate, mind you. It's not just a wild free-for-all, but when you do it right, it's a very powerful tool for people to open up their eyes to what are the root causes of their own particular problems, as well as you as a interested analyst to discover them together. A mind map is an interesting alternative to a fishbone. It's putting the problem in the middle and branching out the cause categories from it in not quite such a regimented way as a fishbone, and people like it for that reason. And you can add on to it pretty easily, perhaps more easily than a fishbone. It's like taking notes in school, which this tool actually started out as a note-taking tool by somebody in Great Britain, invented it. And I always say I wish I had learned this back in school, because I always took notes in a more hierarchical way, which did not really help me. And similarly, when you're doing a root cause analysis, this kind of tool can be quite useful. So to recast that previous fishbone as a mind map, it would look something like this. I used a tool, I forget which one to generate this, but putting the medical records in the middle and branching out the systems, people, process, and machines subcategories off from that is also the same 4 categories as we saw before, but it's done in a way that is more fluid, perhaps. I'm just curious. Oh, by the way, somebody wrote in, XMind is a great free mind mapping tool. XMIND. For those of you who are looking for a tool, XMIND. PowerPoint has one, and I bought Mind Map or something years ago, but I like the idea of a free tool. Which of these do you prefer, Fishbone or Mind Map? Those of you that have done both. I'm just curious your thoughts. Just curious. So Catherine, thank you. Mind Map. Another person says Mind Maps. Depends. Okay. Mind Map, emphatically. Thank you for saying that emphatically. I really like that. I have 1 vote for Fishbone on the generation. If old school, Fishbone. So you're talking about your participants that are involved? The audience? Yeah, okay. So if you have maybe more old school people, you might, yuppers, you might find the Fishbone more acceptable. So I think what you're telling me with this is that you guys have a preference for mind map, largely, which I kind of do too, although I like them both, is to use your audience and be mindful of the audience for choosing the tool. So it's a good tool for root cause analysis, fairly quick, visual, done in groups, gets buy-in, a lot of good things. Let's move on to the 4th tool now. It's the Pareto Diagram. It's a graphical tool that helps you apply what's called a Pareto principle. The Pareto principle is, of course, the 80-20 rule. So that in example, 80% of your company sales may come from 20% of the products. 80% of a given problem comes from 20% of the causes, is how we're talking about it here. So it's focusing on the greatest area for improvement, which I really, really like about Pareto, because it gives you the relative importance. As long as you have data, when there's a large number of symptoms, when there's only a couple of symptoms, it's not so useful, but you get 5 or more categories that you could measure, it becomes highly useful. Again, I'm assuming you've at least heard about Pareto, if not outright used it, and it is a good tool to use with Excel. And it's, yeah, as somebody says, lets the data drive you, and it's a great evidence for your stakeholders as well, because they then can see for themselves what are the most important things. They may be focused intuitively on something that's not as important. So I'm not going to go through this in a lot of detail. I'm going to let the slides talk for themselves when you get a copy, but basically what you want to do is focus again, number 1, on a problem. Look at the different causes, and where do you come up with those? One place might be from your mind maps or your interviewing. Look at the sample size. So basically 3 and 4 are dealing with the sample size. How much of a collection period are you going to do? And then you go off and collect the data. Those are the first 5 steps. Once your data is collected, then you array it according to the most frequent on the left down to the least frequent on the right. And so you set up the chart, and again, Excel is great for doing this. And I'm not the most brilliant Excel person, but I figured it out using charting, and so it's not super difficult. And so you lay out the percentages, and you start seeing some patterns. So the 10th and 11th steps here show the curve, which I call the Pareto curve, that at some point will cross the threshold or the so-called break point that's around the 80% level, which means the causes to the left are the most significant ones, roughly 20% of them, and not exactly, depending on your sample size, but roughly the 20% of things that cause 80% of the problems. What that means is that those are the vital few, as they like to call them, that you want to focus on for solving. those trivial many off to the right, the 80%, are things that you can either live with or prioritize and deal with later after you've gotten the vital few solved. It's a wonderful way to focus in on the most important things, and I like using this for prioritizing of work to be done. So like as a contributor to the product backlog, for instance, to solve those issues, focusing on those all the time versus maybe using more of an emotional way to prioritize. So it gives some data, and I really like that about this tool. So it has its drawbacks, to be sure. You need some data for this. It takes some time to collect the data. Without that, the tool becomes pretty difficult, right? Because either it has to take you so long to collect the data, you don't really have time for it. And how often do you get to actually do needs assessments anyway in your work? Think about that. I'm just curious. Yeah, if you have thoughts about that, about how much time you have available, shoot it on into me. So, because that is, again, a downside to this tool, is that it does take some time. Or if you have the data available, then you can certainly make good use of it. All right, so now let's move on to the last technique, and that is interrelationship diagrams. This is probably the least heard of technique in the lot. What it does is focuses in on a problem, like customer reports are not being sent out timely enough. And the way you get started with an interrelationship diagram is to look at the main contributors, again, from Pareto or from Fishbones or interviewing, however you come up with these, and lay them out in a graphical way like this. And then using your stakeholders' insider knowledge, find out some causes. So like low wages are causing staff shortages and scheduling problems. And shortage of staff in turn causes not enough paper to be available. That sounds kind of bogus, but okay, somebody threw that out as it was a way to run with it. Database extract delays are being delayed because we don't have people to run the software, or scheduling problems because we don't have enough staff. So you go around and around each bubble, you ask how might it cause some other problem inside this little ecosystem here of things, and pretty soon you will get a lot of crisscrossing lines. If you don't, the problem is probably not worth further analysis, because the interrelationship diagram works best when you have these interrelating cause and effects. As I said earlier, the cause of one thing, like low wages causing shortage of staff, in turn, shortage of staff becomes a cause for other things like the extracts or scheduling or whatever. So then now the fun begins. Once you've got the arrows in place, then you can count the number of times that there are incoming causes. Just count the number of arrowheads coming in. There are 3 for this not enough paper, and 1 outgoing effect. And then for staff shortages, there's 1 input and 3 output. Low wages, there's nothing that is the cause of low wages here in this little diagram. Scheduling is 2, 2. Extract delays have 4 incoming causes and no outgoing effects. And the operating system is just the opposite, nothing input and 2 outgoing effects. So what you can do then is take a look at this and realize that staff shortages are probably one of the biggest causes of other problems, okay? Because it's got 3 outgoing arrows on it. And the extract delays are not something you really have to worry about so much. They're more of an effect of everything. So the fact that if somebody wants to fix those extract delays, you've got ammunition to say, hey, that's not really the cause, it's really more of an effect. It's a symptom. You could also further step back and say the real ultimate root cause of staff shortages may well, in fact, be low wages, because it's determined as a cause of staff shortages. So maybe what we need to do is fix the pay we give people, which in turn will help with staff shortages. There may be some other things. If we need to fix this problem in a hurry, we have to do some other mitigating things, but longer term, low wages will be the best ultimate solution for this particular problem. So there you have it. That's our 5. And I want to say one just quick thing in passing here as we wrap up about using these tools as a way to prioritize features and functions that you work on during a project. In other words, it could be an input to a product backlog if you're using that, or certainly any prioritization scheme on your project, so that the data, like we're talking about for Pareto, is a great proving tool for why we want to focus on certain things before others. Or maybe we just ignore other things, like the machinery and the Fishbone was just not important enough to really cause us to deal with. Or some of the cause categories in our interrelationship diagram are more effects, and so they're not causes. Let's work on the big cause first, and that gets higher priority. So this is a useful root cause tools are useful for prioritization, I guess, is the long-winded way I've coming to as far as saying that. So as we wrap up, I want to just summarize by saying we've looked at root cause for basically 3 different techniques, or 3 different circumstances. One is the understanding of the problem or opportunity, or the uncovering of root cause, as well as looking at complex causes and interacting factors, if those exist. So given the different tools, there is one in particular that's the most useful, perhaps, for understanding the problem or opportunity. Okay, let's take a look at the 5 different types. Consultative interviewing, Pareto, 5 whys, Fishbone mind maps, or interrelationship diagrams. So I think for understanding the problem or opportunity, I think the consultative interviewing technique is the best one for doing that. There are 3 that I think are the best at uncovering root causes that we talked about. And those would be the 3 in the middle: Pareto's, the 5 whys, and the Fishbone mind maps. And that leaves one, right? The interrelationship diagram, which is left over for dealing with the complex issues and interacting factors. So that's the long and the short of it, if you will. And I want to just wrap up now by opening up the floor to your questions and comments. I'm going to try to go back through what you've sent me as we've been talking. I hope I didn't miss a question as I was deleting some of the comments. Sometimes that happens to me. So if I don't get to your question, please send it back in. Somebody is saying one thing to mention too is that the BAs need to be ready to change while the data is revealed. Could you elaborate on that, Tina, about be ready to change while the data is revealed? So send me that in. So the rest of you, as we're waiting for that, do send me in your questions about any of the tools. I look forward to hearing your questions and comments about applying them, how well they would be applicable in your environment. So all right, here we go. Okay, I got some things coming in. So Tina says, meaning when the BA finds the data, they have to be ready to change their approach to make sure. You say Tina, the handy BA. So yes, I think with all of these tools, it's a good point to mention that as we do business analysis and uncovering needs, that we may change our view of what the root cause is as well as our stakeholders. That I think a key to using this is not have a closed mind to anything and use tools to prove our point, but to be open to exploring and curious to find out what the root cause is. So that's a great comment. Thank you. Direction. Whoops. Ah, shoot. I think I deleted something I didn't mean to delete. So the person who sent something else in could you please resend it, because I think I deleted by accident the question. I know there was another comment, so it's probably still sitting in your GoToWebinar question panel. You can maybe just copy the text and send it on into me again, please, because once I've deleted them, I don't have access to them at my ready here. I'm seeing if I can find that in. Mary Beth, thank you, Mary Beth. That was the name. Okay, great content, especially the application of each with real world examples. Thank you for the comment. That's great. What can you see using them for in your next effort? Either Mary Beth or anybody else. I mean, how might you approach using the concepts we talked about today in your next effort? Let me throw that out to you. Okay, Janet is saying, root cause for why a business process keeps failing. I love it, yes. If you identified a process, one thing we didn't talk about today is using process mapping to get to root cause. Another root cause tool you could use is look at each step of a process and break down each step to look at how it's contributing to the ultimate problem you're trying to solve. So that's another adjunct in addition, but these 5 certainly could help you with these. And again, I'd encourage you to be brave and use these techniques, even when your stakeholders want to be jumping to solutions. I'm curious, does it happen to you, or how often does it happen to you, that your stakeholders have a solution in mind? Let's say the process is breaking down. Maybe they just want to jump to a new process and throw away the old, and let's bring in a software package to solve all of our problems, etc. And they are ready to jump to a solution because they're sick of the problem and they just want to fix it. So send me in any anecdotes or thoughts about that. Meanwhile, Mary Beth says, for us, it was a good reminder for approaches and also gave different perspectives on each. And not just to say why all the time. Yeah, rephrasing is a good set of things. Hopefully you can use some of the phrases here for your next effort so that you don't just say why. Especially, I think, puts people on the defensive. One thing I didn't talk about, I know when someone asks me, just kind of barks at me, why? I immediately feel defensive, and I either have the reaction of, well, why should I tell you? Or I might be more dug in on my position as opposed to exploring further. So it's not, those softer phrases are great for getting people to open up. Getting people to open up about what their real needs are. So nobody is stepping forward. If I give this presentation in person, I can usually see heads nodding, and of course I can't see your heads here. Tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to put my webcam on again because we're in the Q&A session here. So, hi. What kinds of problems are caused in your environment when you have stakeholders jumping to solutions? And what are your challenges doing your work when people heads are nodding? Thinking, good. Missed opportunities I'm seeing, not getting the buy-in from others. And when you don't get the buy-in from others, does that mean people don't adopt a solution? Does that happen? There are people sort of work around it. They stick to their old spreadsheets. They don't use the new system you've worked so hard on. Does that happen? They miss requirements, no buy-in, requirements are not managed, not clarified. They don't solve the real problem. Leading the answer, which leads to the wrong and costly solution. Yet people don't adopt changes easily. Yes, absolutely. Buy-in, stay with the old, fear of change. Yes. I like all of your thoughts here, folks, because they are very detrimental to us really doing the business the best job we can as far as adopting positive change that solves the real problems. And somebody else says finding out the actual problem during testing because you're not getting to the root cause in the beginning. There's only one thing worse than finding the actual cause during testing. What is that? There's only one thing worse than finding the actual problem during testing. Amy says production. You got it. That's right. Or as my friend Jim used to say, well, that's a production test. If it works, it's production. If it didn't, it's a test. Anyway, so you missed the best solutions. Let's see. How can you help people not to jump to the solution? I think if you can get stakeholders on board with doing the root cause techniques we've talked about, that's your best ally, is to organize some efforts, have just a set of these techniques we've talked about and go through them with stakeholders so that you are doing it in an organized way and convince them that these are standard techniques in our bodies of knowledge. That goes a long way. And I think some of the techniques, like mind maps, are potentially fun for people to do. They're more interactive. So I think that gets you some more mileage. Let's see. Mary Sabel, I hope I didn't mispronounce your name. If, like in both examples, the root cause of the issue, like the potholes or the pay rates, are not feasible due to cost, what approach would you take to suggest a feasible approach to mitigate the issue? I think that's where the alternatives come in, because I would still urge you to recommend the best solution, knowing maybe it's not even feasible, and say, okay, here are alternatives to doing what we can. So maybe instead of repaving the entire street, we break it into sections and divide it up over time. Maybe this year we do 1 mile and next year we do another mile and so forth. So that instead of doing 5 miles of repaving in 1 year, you break it into more affordable chunks. So that's one quick thing off the top of my mind. Secondly, perhaps going to the Pareto, maybe you're not able to solve the most common problem. Maybe you look at the second most common and choose to do that, perhaps because it's more feasible or more affordable. So always be looking for alternatives, and hopefully that's a good answer for what you're asking about. Thanks very much for the question. That's good. I'm curious, can you see my webcam? I don't usually show it. I don't know why I decided to. Maybe I'm just trying to turn over a new leaf. Okay, good. In other webinars you've done, have presenters shown a webcam? And does it add anything? Because I didn't have it on during this session because I don't particularly like how I look, but indifferent. Okay, I'm glad. Somebody says yes, it adds. Okay. Maybe during the Q&A it's even better. It does take up real estate, doesn't it? Yeah, and that's one of the reasons I didn't want to do it during the actual presentation. The nonverbals, right? That's good. Not just the tone of voice, right? But the it can be disruptive when showing the slides. I agree. So thanks for your feedback about it. I thought it might be interesting during the Q&A, and during the intro would be nice. That's true too. I did it before the session started. I had the webcam on before I started the broadcast. But well, guys, thank you. This is we're at the end of our hour. Thank you, Mary Beth. It's the top of the hour. I'm glad you participated. Thank you for your thoughts and comments, and I really look forward to having you again at another one of our webinars. Look for the announcements in our newsletters, and I'm going to stop the session now and stop the recording.